Hi, Writers. Thank you for joining Cruise today. In this video, we're going to be looking at two sample essays. Both essays scored 8s, and 8 is the best you can get in Accuplacer Writeplacer essays. So in this video, we are looking at the Apex essays. And rather than reading the entire essays and critiquing them after the full reading, we're going to take this video in a little bit of a different direction by just taking sample essay number 1, and we're going to read it one paragraph at a time, critique each paragraph, and then moving on to sample essay number 2. So if this video sounds worthy of your time, stay tuned. All right, writers, so let's take a look at sample essay number 1 with a score of 8, and we'll begin with paragraph 1. There are over 4 billion people on planet Earth. While thousands of people are born every day, where the child is born and where they are raised is completely spontaneous and out of their control. Gordon D. Marino believes that no one has firm control of what happens to him or her, or with what transpires throughout their life. His take has a significant amount of validity, which can't be justified. However, people have the ability and possibility to prevent the negatives throughout life with proper structure. Okay, so looking at paragraph number 1, what is interesting in that in these particular Writeplacer Accuplacer essays, this is the first time that text evidence is brought up that was provided by Writeplacer Accuplacer, because Gordon D. Marino's name is actually mentioned, as well as his beliefs. And so this is interesting for me because I've read through all of these sample essays, and for the first time in a score of 8, I'm actually seeing Gordon D. Marino's name mentioned specifically. So I can already tell you, writers, that by bringing up the text evidence that's provided by Writeplacer Accuplacer, there's a good chance you're moving your score up. With that said, in looking at paragraph 1, their introduction paragraph, as you can see, they went very broad, bringing up 4 billion people on Earth. They talk about what happens when a child is born, and then they bring up Gordon D. Marino's claim that, again, no one has control of what happens to him or her. And then they go into the fact that, yes, it's valid what he's saying. However, this particular student, this writer, goes in a different direction by saying people do have the ability and possibility to preventing the negatives with proper structure. So you can tell that this student somewhat disagrees with Gordon D. Marino's claim. However, this student is not very specific by saying, I agree or disagree. Instead, the student went broad and just said that people have the ability to prevent the negatives throughout their life. So just, again, analyzing paragraph number 1. Now moving on, which is basically the introduction. Moving on to paragraph number 2. As it pertains to Gordon D. Marino's passage, there is no right or wrong answer. Granted, people are brought into unfortunate and inconvenient situations, but that doesn't negate the fact that they can't overcome the fallacies and transgressions they endure. An abundance of people come from broken homes, negligent parents who are in poverty, unsophisticated school systems, third world countries, and so forth. I undoubtedly understand that people strongly feel like there is no way out or a solution to the unfortunate circumstances they have encountered. However, there is always a way out. The famous cliche, anything is possible, needs to be embraced a lot more. People going through struggles need to surmise the fact that not one person is better than the other. Other people just so happen to have been fortunately raised in a better environment. There is a way to overcome this. Okay, so here is where the student begins to become more aggressive in their belief system. And it's really comes out here that however, there's always a way out. And a lot of people may feel that there is no way out. However, again, there is always a way out. And they repeat themselves by reiterating the fact where it says, however, there's always a way out. And then they repeat themselves in the end in paragraph 2, which with there is a way to overcome this. And then definitely we see a cliche and they recognize it as a cliche, which is great, which is something interesting this writer did. And they give some examples of people who endure negative situations by giving credit to people who come from broken homes, negligent parents who are in poverty, unsophisticated school systems, and third world countries. So they give specific examples of people who are brought into unfortunate situations, yet they argue that there is a way out. Interestingly, the student began by saying that there is no right or wrong answer. So I find that to be kind of an interesting idea that they brought up, but then they argue in the end that there is a way out and that there is a way to overcome circumstances out of your control. So this definitely in paragraph 2, we see some glimmers of basically where the student is taking a position and again, bringing up Gordon D. Marino and his particular claim. Now let's take a look at the next paragraph, paragraph 3. A prime example of someone who had to overcome his negative surroundings would be my father. He was raised by negligent alcoholic parents who would never amount to anything. They simply did not care. He was getting into trouble as a youth, being thrown in a juvenile detention center at a young age, living in a bad area, and spending his time with the wrong people. He didn't have any money, was a high school dropout, and was in a detention center at 17. He was so upset with the way his life had been going, he decided he was all in and was going to strive for success and wasn't going to stop until he did so. He picked up a book and never put it down, disassociated himself from the negative tension he was constantly around, and gradually progressed. Once he was out of juvenile detention, he acquired a GED, went to a community college, taking online classes while working 3 jobs. Granted, your social life might come to a pause, but the juice is totally worth the squeeze. His most common phrase when talking to me and my siblings were, "Work hard now, have fun later." Ultimately, he went from being a juvenile delinquent from a broken home to a professor of sociology at the University of Georgetown. He constantly enlightens his students about his past transgressions and how anyone can overcome anything if they put in the effort. Okay, fabulous paragraph for several reasons. Number 1, we have what's called a personal example, a personal anecdote. And in this case, the student brings up their father and how their father was able to overcome negative surroundings, again, by putting in the work. This paragraph is also excellent because they give very specific examples. They describe the background of their father, basically how his father, how not his father necessarily, the writer is male, but that how this writer's father basically was a high school dropout, going into detention center, and basically giving us very, very specific examples. And then how that change happens, decides to pick up a book, never put it down, began to disassociate, and basically, acquired his GED, went to community college, and ended up basically working 3 jobs. And this idea, work hard now, have fun later. And, putting off having fun to, in order to work hard, and that work will ultimately pay off as it did for his father by ending up at Georgetown. So an excellent paragraph, again, really because of the specific examples, and you can instantly relate with this personal example. If I had to say one critique about this paragraph, my only issue is, but the juice is totally worth the squeeze. I think that was some slang brought into it, and it felt a little bit awkward considering the serious situation that he was describing about his dad. And that's all I might say with that particular paragraph. Great usage of conjunctive adverbs, transition words within the paragraph. And you can see writers, even using the level of vocabulary, words like disassociated himself from the negative tension. You see words like, let's see, I'm trying to look at another example here of, juvenile delinquent from a broken home, and this idea of constantly enlightening his students about his past transgressions. So, this level of vocabulary also helps to elevate and level up this particular student's writing. Now, moving on to the next paragraph before we get to the conclusion. So, final body paragraph. I strongly believe that Gordon D. Marino's message has a much broader context. He could be alluding to a plethora of instances that are unpreventable. One might get a flat tire, be in a hostile situation involving a terror attack, a home being wiped out by natural disasters. The examples I just listed are undeniably unpreventable. He could also be alluding to my message about being brought into a broken home, but there is always a way out and a path to success. If you are in poverty, work 3 jobs. If you want to be a physician, go to school and never put the books down. It is all about sacrificing and applying yourself to the best of your abilities. So in this case, again, we can see the sophisticated writing of the student's vocabulary, using words by saying, bringing up that Marino's message has a much broader context and what the message really means, and giving us specific examples in this particular situation. But then again, using elevated language like undeniably unpreventable, this idea of alluding to a message of being brought into a broken home, more examples, but then making the argument that there's always a way out. That if you're in poverty, then work 3 jobs. If you want to be a physician, then go to school. So giving us examples, but then also giving us solutions to problems that we face. And that it is all about sacrificing and applying yourself to the best of your abilities. So again, these ideas are provided by the writer, bringing up, again, the text evidence of Gordon D. Marino, giving us examples, but then offering solutions to those particular problems. Then finally, we get to the conclusion, where the writer brings up, all in all, with Gordon's message, there is no right or wrong answer. Notice, writers, how this student alludes to, reiterates, really not alluding to, but restates what they mentioned in their introduction, that there is no right or wrong answer. We do not have control on Mother Nature and the outside forces that exist outside of us. We do not have control of where we were born, who raised us, what class we were brought into, what country we were born in, but we do have control of our bodies and what we want to do with it. The people who claim each individual is responsible for what happens to him or her has significant validity as well. People don't have to commit crimes. People don't have to be in poverty. It all comes down to whether or not you can overcome the unfortunate circumstances and apply yourself to be the best possible person. And so, again, arguing the point and being very specific in their point and using repetition by making their argument that, again, no matter what, you can come up with all the excuses that you want. However, you ultimately have control, and making their argument that, again, it all comes down that there is no right or wrong answer, that ultimately it just comes down to who you want to become. And so with that said, writers, I think again, this conclusion reiterates what was mentioned in the introduction of this no right or wrong answer, then brings up, which was mentioned in the introduction. I'll go back here, and that is where the writer says there is no right or wrong answer. And so it was brought up not in the introduction paragraph, but in the second paragraph, and the writer repeats that. And then again, in their last paragraph, they use repetition to emphasize a point. And so you can see where this essay sort of comes full circle of where the child is born, where they are raised is completely spontaneous and out of their control, and that no one has firm control of what happens in their life. However, people have the ability to prevent the negatives with proper structure. And really, that structure is, again, just making a decision that you're not going to go in that direction, and that you take charge of your own life. No doubt this student, again, used some excellent strategies. Bring in a personal example, bring in the text evidence, bring in a high level of vocabulary, bring in a very specific argument, take a position on that argument, and again, use good grammar and proper transition words between paragraphs. Let's take a look at how they did as far as moving between paragraphs. Obviously, they said people have the ability to prevent the negatives. And then they say, granted, people are brought into unfortunate and inconvenient situations. And then they say at the first sentence that Gordon D. Marino's passage, there is no right or wrong answer. I think this sentence here, there's a little bit of a hiccup between these two paragraphs. I would argue that if you looked at this sentence here and moved back to Gordon D. Marino's passage, that may have been a better transition. So it's okay. It's not the best as far as the transition between the introduction and body paragraph number 1. Now, as it pertains to paragraph 2 and 3, there's an excellent transition, because there is a way to overcome this. A prime example who had to overcome negative surroundings would be my father. And that is offered in this next paragraph. So this is an excellent example of a transition between paragraphs where you adequately flow from one idea to the next. Then we move on from this paragraph of how can anyone, he constantly enlightens his students about his past transgressions and how anyone can overcome anything if they put in the effort. And then he goes into, the writer rather, goes into, I strongly feel that Gordon D. Marino's message has a much broader context. A little bit of a, not necessarily the most fluid transition, but there's not really a hiccup. So you don't really notice the transition between the paragraphs, which is important. I argue the better transition happens between paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. Moving on, it goes into, it is all about sacrificing and applying yourself to the best of your abilities. Then going into all in all with Gordon's message, there is no right or wrong answer. Again, not necessarily the most fluid transition between paragraphs. However, it is not disruptive. And so that's what you want to avoid, right, writers? You want to avoid any, what I call big hiccups, where the writer is reading and they're like, between paragraphs. And that's when you have that kind of hiccup, it's noticeable and it makes your writing, basically sends an alarm in your writing. And so you don't want to have these hiccups between paragraphs. So again, you see this example, right, writers, of how this 8 really happens based on many factors, including, again, personal example, using text evidence, making your argument, using those personal examples, going broader, using more general examples, and then creating that emphasis by repetition to really make your point by saying, we do not have control, we do not have control, but what we do have control. And so that really creates an awesome message at the end. It just creates that strong conclusion where the writer feels satisfied with what they've read. With that said, Right Writers, let's go ahead and move on to sample essay number 2, which also scored an 8. Let's take a look. In her 2008 Harvard commencement speech, author J.K. Rowling invited recent graduates to take responsibility for their own lives. Rowling argued that each individual must ardently grab the steering wheel of her own life as soon as she is able. Relying on her parents, professors, or peers to give one's life direction, purpose, or structure is simply not an option. Okay, so in this case, in this first paragraph, we do not hear a reference to Gordon D. Marino's claim as in the first essay, but instead the writer is referencing J.K. Rowling. So in this case, that's interesting. An interesting take that the writer chose to use is that they just selected their own person whom they wanted to expound upon in their introduction. Obviously, you can see the introduction is quite short, but notice, the vocabulary. You see words like, an individual must ardently grab the steering wheel. Yes, there was a little bit of a spelling issue, but we understand that was probably a typo. And we know that the student's position is that you've got to grab the steering wheel of your own life as soon as you are able, in order, and do not rely on others to give your life direction, purpose, or structure. And so this is definitely one of those examples of, again, we see the position taken by the student. And let's look at the next paragraph to see how they expand upon that. I agree with Rowling's assertion that we are in charge of our own lives. The complication arises, however, when we acknowledge that the materials we have been given to lead those lives vary greatly from person to person. In keeping with the car analogy, I may be driving a Toyota Corolla with 90,000 miles on it, while another person may be careening through the world from the scooped seat of a brand new BMW. In other words, yes, we make our own choices and we are responsible for how we lead our lives, but each one of us makes those choices and selects our paths within a framework which we cannot control. So in this second paragraph, they agree with the assertion, but then they then sort of provide a counter argument where they begin to discuss, rather than using person to person, they just use a car and use a comparison of the Toyota Corolla with the BMW. And again, that we have these choices and that we select these paths. So very interesting to move from one idea to the next. We go from an author and the author's take on life, then using a car analogy, comparing our lives and what we're driving, the Corolla to the BMW. Again, very specific examples, different examples, but specific, using, again, more elevated, leveling up their language, using words like careening through the world, which, again, has a very different effect than just, speeding through life. So, excellent, just sort of excellent examples there as far as what they're talking about, even though they are vastly different. Then let's go ahead to the next paragraph, paragraph 3. Never is this clearer than in discussions of privilege. Axioms such as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, highlight the idea that our circumstances force us to start from different places. Oprah Winfrey, for instance, is so fascinating to the American public because of her rags to riches story. A young woman born into poverty who suffered years of horrific abuse from relatives who still managed to rise to stardom, acquire wealth, and wield power with generosity and compassion. Still, other public figures receive significant scrutiny for their lack of need to self start. President George W. Bush was frequently derided for his cushy upbringing, which led him to studies at Yale and a presidency which to some seemed to result more from his family wealth and political connections than from genuine preparedness for office. So, again, very similar idea that this student takes, giving us very specific examples, but different from the other examples. So, we go from a well known author of obviously world renowned Harry Potter series to a Toyota Corolla and BMW, to then bringing up Oprah Winfrey, followed by President George W. Bush. So, again, noticing writers, these very different examples from this particular student, but those examples are clear and making these arguments and then counter arguments. Um, again, giving us an example of someone who came from poverty, moved up, but then someone who came from wealth and then was scrutinized because of it. Notice again the level of vocabulary as well. Words like, wielding power. We see words, love that, with significant scrutiny, frequently derided for his cushy upbringing. Again, political connections then from genuine preparedness for office. All of this helps to elevate this student's writing, which is awesome. Again, I'm just interested to kind of see where this student goes next in the next examples as far as what they offer to the reader. In the next paragraph, the student goes on to famous television personalities and politicians provide ample fodder for the frustration many of us feel when faced with Rowling's demand that we take the wheels of our own lives, and yet the complex relationship between personal responsibility and predetermined circumstance plays itself out in ordinary lives as well. Having recently chosen to return to school for another degree, I feel emboldened and proud of this decision I am making. However, I also recognize that the support of my parents in high school, driving me to theater practice, paying for my voice lessons, buying me as many books as I could read, and their continued bolstering of me in college has laid the groundwork for my academic success and confidence. I could not have succeeded in high school, college, and graduate school, and then considered more education without their emotional and financial support. So then the student sort of goes into, they zoom out by bringing up everything they've mentioned and then brings up their own personal example, which is quite interesting in this particular piece, in this particular paragraph, rather. Then they go on to say, again, we see vocabulary such as emboldened and, continued bolstering. So again, elevating the language, even this idea of, playing this out with provide ample fodder for the frustration many of us feel. Excellent writing. This student has a serious command of the English language, and it is quite apparent not just in this student's grammar, but also in their word choice. So in this particular paragraph, they sort of come back full circle and bring it in their own personal bring up their own personal experience and examples. Now let's see how this student ends their essay. In the end, we each write our own stories. We are in charge of the choices we make. One eminent psychologist said it best when he claimed, "We do not have control, but we do have choices." We do not control so many things: the decade we are born, the parents we go home with, the teachers who educate us. Yet we do have choices. We choose the clothes we wear, regardless of each decade's fashion frenzies. We choose how we relate to our parents. We choose whether or not to study for the myriad tests and quizzes that pepper our 21st century educations. The outcome of this venture called life will always, at least partially, elude us. But as human beings, we have been given the gift of daily personal choice. To me, that makes all the difference. So we see this, arguing their point through repetition, through the use of semicolons. We each write our own stories. We are in charge. Again, bringing up yet another claim, a psychologist. Now, we don't know the psychologist, but they quoted a psychologist. Again, we choose, this idea of repetition to create emphasis and to argue their point or perspective, which is something interesting that I've noticed with the Accuplacer Writeplacer writers and how they ended up with scores of 8s. Again, looking at what they did, that was quite different from other essays we had read. This elevated language, this idea of repetition for emphasis, and coming full circle in their writing from, the beginning to the end. And that is, we each write our own stories. And if we go to the top in this particular paragraph, we must ardently grab the steering wheel of our own life as soon as basically we are able, and take responsibility for our own lives. And so that is quite interesting. Again, coming back full circle, in looking at this student's writing, I wondered, boy, they were sort of had all of these very interesting, unique examples, but the examples all work. So now let's take a look at the paragraph transitions. I definitely think some are better than others. In this case, this is a little bit of a pretty solid transition because we go from J.K. Rowling and, giving one's life direction or purpose or structure is simply not an option when we rely on others. And then I agree with Rowling's assertion that we are all in charge of our own lives. And so again, they bring Rowling up and then expand on that in the next paragraph, which is a pretty decent transition. Excellent transition right here, but each one of us makes those choices and selects our paths within a framework which we cannot control. Never is this clearer than in discussions of privilege. So this is an excellent transition between one paragraph and the next, where one idea flows into the next idea. In this one, also a great transition because they talk about the preparedness for office, and then they bring up famous television personalities and politicians provide ample fodder. Obviously, the people they're referring to is Oprah Winfrey and President George W. Bush. That's who they're referring to here. So that also provides a smooth transition from one paragraph into the next one. And then we have at the end here that the writer recognizes that they could not have succeeded, but that in the end, we each write our own stories and that we are in charge of the choices we make. And so they then transition from their own personal experience and how we write our own stories. Not too bad of a transition. Again, I think this writer had some smoother ones in some previous paragraphs, but it's fluid enough to where it is not a hiccup. We do not notice it. I think it's interesting that this particular student did not at all use the examples provided by Accuplacer Writeplacer. Instead, they gave their own examples of individuals whom they wanted to reference within their essay. Again, very interesting. I mean, I think what's interesting for me as well is that how much these essays have in common. They're more alike than they are different in that they both gave a personal example, and then they both gave examples, other examples as well within their essay. And they really, their final conclusions, their final paragraphs were very strong, were repetitive to create emphasis, to emphasize their points. They used repetition to their advantage and had elevated vocabulary. No doubt these writers had significant command of the English language, and you could understand why they scored eights. So, right, writers, I hope that this process, again, just seeing these different videos going from a sample essay of 1 all the way to an 8, you can pick and choose obviously the videos that you want to look at. But my hope is that you're able to understand the transitions between, well, what is the difference between a 7 and an 8? And while Accuplacer Writeplacer did give us the anecdotal information, it's just nice to, I think it's nice anyway. That's why I did these videos, to sort of go through paragraph by paragraph and essay by essay and really getting specific into why these essays scored what they scored. Obviously, these are two students who will definitely be moving on beyond even ENC 1101. So with that said, right, writers, thank you so much for watching this video. And again, I hope this process was helpful and useful for you as you endeavor to improve your own education, take charge of your education, and improve your Accuplacer Writeplacer score. Thank you so much, right, writers. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Bye-bye.